Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, December 29, 2025, and our dear friend Ray McGovern is here with us. Welcome back, Ray.
Thank you, Nima. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, Ray. Let me start, Ray, with the meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky. After all, many people would ask, would argue, is there anything coming out of these meetings? Is there something happening that we don't know, we are not aware of? And how do you see the current situation between Donald Trump and Putin? We know they're facing a very complicated and difficult situation with the case of Ukraine, but how capable are they to get rid of the problem in Ukraine?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked how capable they are. When Biden was in power, the Russians complained bitterly that he was not capable. Not capable of what? Well, dogovor is the Russian word. A dogovor means agreement or treaty, so he was sposobny means able. They said new word in Russian as far as I'm concerned. Не договороспособный, not able to make a treaty or an agreement of any kind. They also said, or they said less frequently, that he was разговор is the word for talk. Okay, he was не разговороспособный. He wasn't even able to talk, to communicate, to converse. Now, when Trump came in, my God, he vitiated one downside there. He was договороспособный. He was able to talk, and he talked, and he talks a lot, doesn't he? Right? He's talked several times with Putin personally, and he's had Witkoff spend hours and hours with Putin. So that was surmounted. But is Trump договороспособный? Is he able to make a deal? The Russians don't know. I don't know. Maybe you know, Nima. But he's got real constraints on him. And therein lies the problem. Trump yesterday acted as if, well, Vladimir Vladimirovich and Putin and I, have this thing kind of made. I talked to him before. I talked to him for 2.5 hours, he says. Oh, well, the Russian readout says it was only 1 hour and 15 minutes. So, so Trump tends to exaggerate, right? This time he doubled it. It was 2.5 hours. He said, okay. Well, what does all this mean? Well, Trump seems to think that he and Putin can work this thing out and put the Europeans and Zelensky in their proper place. Now, does he have reason to believe this? I believe he does. Okay, who? What are the flies in the ointment? Well, the biggest fly, of course, is the Europeans. What about the Europeans? Well, for some strange reason, they don't want peace in Ukraine. They're fighting very hard. And now, what about the Europeans yesterday at this major meeting in Marilago? Well, they weren't really mentioned till the end. It's, oh yeah, now let's call the Europeans, and they called the same seven dwarfs that appeared after the summit in Alaska in August. The same seven dwarfs. Well, this is what we're going to do. So, can Trump push this through? Well, I guess the real question is how much incentive he has. Uh, his incentive is to get Ukraine out of the way so he can develop a decent relationship with Russia and turn his attention to other things, including the midterm elections. Okay. He also wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, that sounds like sounds puerile or adolescent, but you've got a narcissist. That's what he wants. Okay. How about Putin? Putin has like a lot of incentive. Okay. He doesn't want to have to deal with a Vietnam type insurrection in the rest of Ukraine. If he conquers all he wants to up to the Dnieper River, he doesn't want that. He'd be crazy if he wanted that. What's the outcome? The outcome has to be negotiated. Now, Russia is winning on the land, it's going to win definitively, and it already is. So, what's to negotiate? Well, a treaty or some kind of agreement where the U.S. agrees to do good by Ukraine, promising Russia won't invade you again, but then wipe the whole thing off the map by getting this done, and that means the Ukrainians will have to cede at least the Donbass. That is, those two provinces there, Donetsk and Luhansk, and probably Zaporozhye and Kherson as well. Although, in my view, Putin is willing to deal to make some sort of concessions with respect to Zaporozhye and Kherson. There are all kinds of things that you can imagine. There could be buffer zones or so forth. So what's happening here is that Trump is saying, okay, you Europeans and Zelensky, we put you in your place now. Let's see what happens when we get together in these working groups, which the Russians have officially approved now. So the business about Putin not being interested in the deal, he is interested in the deal. He foresees a Europe that will be more secure, and the U.S. stays in, but not really as part of NATO, but as a co a co big country to kind of have domain over Europe, what the Europeans shunted aside. And I just like to maybe while I'm thinking about the Europeans, I'll say the Europeans have been really, really mum. Haven't said a word except the German newspaper, the most widely circulated one. It's an Axel Springer thing. It's a rightist newspaper, but it's got an article today. No, yesterday, even before the summit, and it talks about Schmerz and talks about Wahrheit, and it says, "Look, this is painful, schmerzlich, but we have to recognize the Wahrheit, and the Wahrheit is Russia has won. We have to do the best deal we can. We can't pretend anymore. We got to deal with this thing, or else it's going to be worse. We got to deal with it now." And I asked some friends in Europe about whether this is a harbinger of things to come, and the most reliable sources say it indeed is. It's just a matter of time before the Europeans realize who's got all the cards here, uh, how they cannot possibly finance and arm Ukraine for another 2 or 3 years just because Zelensky wants it. So the deal is struck. The incentive is a little different from between Putin and Trump, but they both want this. And the other fly in the ointment here is Rubio, Marco Rubio, the titular Secretary of State. Now, it really is worth talking about him because he's been shunted aside. It was so embarrassing yesterday, Trump always talked about Witkoff and Jerry and Jared, his son-in-law, Kushner. And they said, oh, yeah, Marco, too. Oh, Marco and others worked in. And Zelensky just talked about Witkoff and Kunster. He forgot even to mention Marco Rubio. So Rubio is the fly in the ointment. And he has a lot of equity in this because he's a lot of people like him that think you can't deal with the Russians. And I'll just cite one example of that because it comes to mind. It was really amazing. After uh, one of these sessions in Europe, where Rubio was there as well as Witkoff and Kushner, Rubio emerged from that and said, "This is fantastic. We are closer than ever. We've come to an agreement." And of course, the agreement was the Ukrainian terms for this resolution. Okay, now he came back, and all of a sudden, Kushner and Wikoff says, "Forget about that," and they dismissed that and just gave their 28 points when they met with Putin for 5 hours plus just a couple of days later. Now, at one point, Rubio made a point of briefing Congress. Congress very sympathetic to Rubio, and he said, that was a Russian plan. That was a Russian plan. Yeah, the one that the 28 points that was made up with the Russians. And then, of course, the senators leaked that as Rubio fully expected, and they said, "Oh no, I didn't say that. I didn't." So he backtracked, but the senators heard him. That's what he said. Why did he say that? Well, I hate to tell you this, guys, but it was a Russian plan. It was Dmitriev coming to Miami, meeting with Witkoff and Kushner for 3 days. They had Umerov come from Ukraine, and that was the plan. Yeah. How do we know how strongly Rubio is against this? I'm sure he and his friends leaked, and this last thing I'll say on this, leaked an intercepted telephone conversation between Dmitriev in Saudi Arabia and Ushakov, Putin's right person on these matters, in Moscow. Whoa! An intercepted conversation between Saudi Arabia. Who could do that? Well, the betting is that the Five Eyes of the U.S. and NSA they could do it. Also, the Saudi Arabians could. The point is that it was leaked, okay, and the leak shows that here's Demetrius saying, okay, yeah, Ushakov, let's this will please the Americans, and yeah, we'll go for broke, and then they'll trim it down, and so this was all. It was all documented by this intercepted message. Who leaked the intercepted message? There had to be somebody like Rubio or maybe Kellogg or somebody else to point out how bad it was that the Russians drafted this thing. Now, why did Witkoff and Kushner ask the Russians to do the first draft? Who else? They're going to ask Rubio? Come on, give me a break. So they worked this thing out, and that was the thing that Putin bragged about staying awake. He said, "Was this long?" Yeah, that was too long, he says, but we covered a lot of territory, and it was worth it because we devoted time to each one of those, virtually each one of those 28 points. Putin talking. So Rubio is shunted to the side, but he's still forced to contend with. Uh, and so what happens? Well, they have to give Rubio enough satisfaction that they're bringing his troops and then the Europeans in to say, look, we're consulting with the Europeans. This time the Europeans have to get the message, not like they didn't get the message when they sat on the 18th of August, I think, of this year, and listened to Trump talk about what's going to happen in Ukraine. Part of that deal in Alaska was to make sure that Zelensky and his friends in Europe were not going to put the kibosh on it. We're not going to sabotage it. And that's why the Russians have been saying ever since then that, look, you reneged on this, Trump. You promised that they wouldn't put the kibosh on this, and they have. Will they do it this time? I don't think so. But, I'm an outlier on that. Most people are much more pessimistic. I'm a half glass full, maybe a little bit more than a half glass full on this one.
Ray, I think the key is the priorities on the part of the two presidents, on the part of Donald Trump and Putin, and how these priorities can meet the way that they can make some sort of common ground to work with each other.
Well, it's a really good question because it's very clear now with the new national security strategy document that their overall priorities are virtually the same. Now, the Russians have made it very clear, nobody seems to believe this, but the Russians have made it very clear that their overarching priority, their superseding priority, is to create a decent relationship with the United States, to rebuild what was before Biden, at least, maybe better. Okay. Now, you have to say, well, why? Well, the simple answer is We came close to nuclear war under Biden. Last couple of months, well, you remember that. It was not only Scott Ritter, but now we have Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov asserting that we were really close. It was closer than we ever want to be to nuclear war in the last test. So I see his overarching aim, Putin's, to stop nuclear war. And why is it necessary to cajole and to treat Trump with kid gloves? That's why, okay? Because he's mercurial. Because you can't figure out what he's going to do, and he's a narcissist. And the way you treat a delusional narcissist is to be very, very nice to them. Uh, so that's my idea of Putin and the Russian leadership's priority. With respect to Trump, I think I said before, he wants to be able to brag about getting this deal. Now, this was a really tough deal, okay? Now he's got all the cards. Why? Well, because he wants a decent relationship with Putin. Why do I say that? Because this new national security strategy document says as much. It was an amazing document. Even Putin at that end of the year Q&A says, "Look, don't you Europeans read that national security strategy document? It shows that we're no longer the enemy. We're a partner of the United States." And it says, that document, it says, we're going to try to address the Ukrainian problem together, so that we can have a better relationship with Russia. Those are our priorities, okay? Right? Europe comes third, Europe doesn't matter. Europe is already sort of excluded itself. So we have a convergence where Trump, for whatever reason, wants to have a decent relationship with Russia, wants to get this thing behind him, and wants to be able, when people say, McGovern, for God's sake, he wants a Nobel Prize. You think that's really motivating him? And I say, yes, I'm sorry. That sounds childish. It sounds narcissistic, but, so I think that's a factor here. Nobel Prize for 2026 is up for grabs. I think Trump would like to get some framework worked out next month before the nominations officially close.
Yeah. Ray, the way that Donald Trump is trying to somehow negotiate with Zelensky, do you think that he's putting some sort of pressure on Zelensky after this meeting? What are the signs, in your opinion, of what has happened during the meeting?
Well, what I was most impressed by was was Trump bragging about having talked with Putin just before the meeting. I mean, he has to be aware that there will be people charging him with taking instructions from his bromance pal Putin, right? Trump doesn't seem to be very concerned about that. That may be a mistake, but he bragged about talking there, and then he said 2.5 hours. It was the Russians say it was 1 hour and 15 minutes, and he said, we get this all worked out, and then and I'm going to call the Russians right after. Oh, I'll call the Europeans too. Yeah, why don't we talk to the Europeans? But then I'll call the Russians. So it seems to me that whether or not he's smart doing this, Trump is feeling his oats, and he thinks he can shove this thing through. The biggest reason, of course, is the Russians have won on the field. They've got very little more to conquer in Donetsk and a little bit in Lugansk. So, you know, the Donbass is gone. That will never be given back. As I said, there may be some flexibility with respect to those other two regions, not on Crimea, of course. So I think Trump sees that we can get these working groups going. We can teach the Europeans that, look, this is schmerzlich. It's very what, painful, but this is reality. Like that Die Welt article was written by a major editor, and they have almost 1 million circulation, paper circulation, they are considered one of the main papers in Germany. And it's not only that, it's also their defense minister, the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius. Okay. Now, what did he say? Well, he said, in effect, that guy Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, he doesn't know what he's talking about. There's not going to be a war. The Russians aren't going to attack us. What's going on? Now, my God, that's not what Merz has been saying. So there's big conflict, there are big holes. And when the defense minister of Germany sort of goes along with what now comes out of Die Welt, you got more than straws in the wind. You have the necessity for the Europeans to wake up and say, "My God, are we going to throw more money at this?" You know, how are we going to defend that money when it comes time for elections, which it will within a year or in a year and a half? And so they have a personal stake in this, but how they resolve it, it's kind of like a no-win situation for them. I think they'll cave just like the Die Welt article suggests they do. I see that as a harbinger of things to come. But, they did exclude themselves, and Trump is making no bones about his cooperation with Putin. The Russian reaction, so far as I saw last night, was circumspect but factual. And the big thing, of course, is they've agreed to participate in these working groups, one on the security factor, one on other things, economics and so forth. So the thing is proceeding ahead. Now, people say, "Oh, this is dead on arrival." What's dead on arrival? The 20 point. Uh, well, the first dead on arrival was 28 points. Then Rubio and the Europeans worked out something was 12, 20 points or 19 points. That was going to do it, right? Witkoff threw that in the trash can, went to the 28 points. I talked to you about that before. 5 hours. They went through them. Okay. Now, the Europeans now have a new, or Zelensky has a new, guess what? New 20 points that he has drafted. Okay. What's going to happen to that? Well, I think if precedent is precedent, passes precedent, you got to go into the trash can too. What Trump said is true. Zelensky has no cards. The Europeans also have no cards now. They're humiliated. They have no way to respond. Their NATO is falling apart. Maybe I ought to just say something about NATO. NATO is nothing without the United States, okay? Now, NATO is without the United States. Even Putin pointed that out. NATO, Defense Alliance. Now, if the United States wants to make friends with us, he didn't say it that way. He wants to have a cordial relationship. What happens to these warmongers in Europe? Does anyone think that Article 5, which obligates the United States, or at least the United States, to go to its legislature and get permission to have a war if Estonia is provokes of conflict with Russia? Nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believed that before. But now we have Putin and Trump saying, look, NATO is finished. The EU is so fragmented that it will probably not recover from this escapade trying to steal that Russian money. Now, if I would say for a decade or so, uh, Ursula von der Leyen is marginalized. They're going to probably impeach her. They should at least. So the EU and NATO, they have suffered the most from all this. And if the US is more interested in having better relations with Russia, and if the, I think I've said this before, but it's significant. When I entered the CIA in 1963, it was to fight against the Glavny Vrak, the main enemy. And who was that? That was the Russians, of course. Glavny Vrak. That's what they called us, the same. Now, guess what happened during 2025? We lost our place. The United States lost this place as the Glavny Vrak. Okay. Who's the Glavny Vrak now, the main enemy? Germany. These are very respected opinion polls in Russia. That should be to no one's liking, you know. Everyone depreciates or it says, look, Gorbachev was a rogue, was really stupid in letting Germany reunite in return for a promise that was violated, namely NATO not expanding 1 inch to the east of the East German border. So Gorbachev was taken to the cleaners, and we never should have reunited Germany. Now, that has to be going through their heads because most, well, not most, all Russians who are educated know what happened when during World War II they lost 27 million Soviet citizens to the Nazi hordes. That's why they hate Nazis, and that's why they hate neo Nazis in Kiev.
Ray, we had Germany reducing the aid to Ukraine. Even when you look at the rhetoric on their part, it's getting more aggressive. But what's behind the scene? What's below the surface? You see, the aid to Ukraine is reducing. That's the reality of what's going on in Ukraine. And it doesn't seem that Europe would be in a better position anytime soon to help Ukraine, just single-handedly, without the United States supporting Ukraine. How? Go ahead. I want to know your take on what's going on in the mind of Europeans after this meeting, for example.
Well, Nima, I think you know that I coined this expression, the or acronym Mickey Matt. It's an expansion of the military industrial complex of Eisenhower. It's the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. It's just as strong, maybe even strong, just as strong in Germany as it is in the United States. There's lots of money to be made. After all, who's this guy Merz? Didn't he come out of one of these financial things that makes all these deals? Give you, for instance, I'm from the Bronx in New York, and we used to give. I'll give you a for instance. Okay, it's a for instance. Before the coup in Kiev, there was this German firm, Maffei, and it was dead in the water because it had been commissioned to build the common European battle tank. And there was no common European danger or enemy to speak of. Okay, before the coup in Kiev. So what happened? Oh, right after that, okay, Maffei and the French company they got the rights and they started building all this stuff. And now uh, the Rheinmetall, the great big concern there in Germany, says, look, Maffei, we have the rights to build a common European. No, no, so they fought it in court, except that they settled out of court. Now their stock, common stock, has gone up about 4 or 5 times. Okay, that's what it's all about. Where's this guy from, Mats? He's from, I forget the name of that big financial organization.
BlackRock,
Yeah,
Ray,
BlackRock.
BlackRock.
And they own half of Ukraine, the fertile fields as well. So that's what's afoot here. That's why he's getting all this money, but they're reducing the aid to Ukraine. Well, they're making believe that the big threat is from Russia, but not right away. The Russians are going to wait until we're ready, and that will be probably 3 or 4 years from now. And Pistorius, their defense minister, has now said, forget about it. This is a charade. uh, Rutte, head of NATO, is talking to his hat. The Russians aren't going to invade Western Europe. And so, for those who still believe that, and who can fault them, that's what Biden said in his last State of the Union address. He says, "Now, anybody in this room think that Putin was stopping Ukraine? No, he'll take Poland and the Baltic states." Now, when the president of the United States says that, sadly, most Americans believe it. A lot of people in Europe believe it. but nothing is farther from the truth. That's why Putin gets a little uncharacteristically agitated when he says, I told you 100 times we don't want to invade Western Europe. We're happy to stop. And as I've said before in your program, the Russians did stop. They stopped 6 weeks after the war began. And now we have the Swiss ambassador to Turkey, who was consulted on all this on the talks in Istanbul in March and April of 2022. He's out now with a video saying exactly what happened. He was in touch with the Turks who are monitoring all this stuff, and he confirms that it was the UK and the US came in and said, no, this is not about what you're thinking. This is about weakening Russia. And so we don't want you to take this deal, and we will support you, Ukraine, for as long as it takes. Now, that's a very sad story because a lot of Ukrainians have died because Zelensky was persuaded to go with the West on that. Now it's as long as it takes, it's over. And why he doesn't see the light, and maybe he will after Mar-a-Lago yesterday, but he keeps telling his troops to fight to the last Ukrainian. And that, of course, is what people like Senator Lindsey Graham favor. You know, not one of our soldiers has been killed. It doesn't matter that a million, and I use that term advisedly, about a million Ukrainian youth and people almost my age have been killed in battle when it was all unnecessary. If the US and the UK didn't tell Zelensky not to take this deal. So they stopped then. That was March, April 2022. I mean, so if they stopped then and they didn't want to take even any part of Ukraine, those provinces were still in Ukraine under that agreement. The only thing was they agreed not to join NATO, and they'll have a little ceasefire and deal with the other problems later. Okay, so they stopped then, and the notion that they would want to take all of Ukraine for one thing, will you stop at Ukraine or Poland and the Baltics? There's no evidence for that. There's not a scintilla of evidence that even the Russians were considered to be very dangerous before the US and the Western services working with it overthrew the duly established government in Kiev on the 14th of February 2014. No, the 22nd of February 2014. And the distinctive thing about that coup was that it was advertised 2.5 weeks in advance. You know that story where Victoria Nuland's talking to U.S. ambassador in Kiev and said, "Oh, we got it all wired. Yats is our guy. Put those other guys aside here. Yatsenyuk is our guy, and this is it." Uh, the Ambassador Pyatt says, "But now, Madam Secretary, the Europeans are not EU. They're not going to like this." And she says, "F the Europeans." Okay, whoa, F the Europeans. Well, how do we know, among other things, that that intercepted conversation was authentic? Well, because the next day she apologized to the Europeans. She said, "Oh, I didn't mean that F the Europeans. No, 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 please, please. I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean that." But she said it. And that's how they look at the Europeans then. And they look with even more disdain, that is, Trump does, at the Europeans now. And they don't give a rat's patootie about how Stammer or Merz or uh, Macron, the three musketeers, feel about these things. It's over. If they want to waste more money, if they want to buy some more U.S. arms, they're welcome to do that because we don't have any arms right now to sell. But well, 3 years. Yeah, 3 years when the Russians didn't give me a break. It's all surrealistic. And the pity is that unless people have access to programs like yours, I mean, and I don't just mean me, I mean, anybody, the excellent people you have on there, unless they have a chance to absorb what the realities are, they're at sea because the major media is the fulcrum of this Mickey Matt. When I say media, I mean in all caps because, well, the media is owned by the corporations for the rest of the Mickey Mac, for God's sake. And the media will not give you the truth. That's what we're working on now. It may, yeah, we show some signs of progress with shows like yours and Judge Napolitano's. I hope that in this coming year we'll be able to make an even bigger dent in the public consciousness, not only in the U.S. but in Europe as well.
Yeah. Ray, two issues are important right now for the case of Ukraine. One of them is the territorial concession, and the other part is withdrawing the troops from Donbass, as Russia was asking. How, as you mentioned, Ukraine has been suffering a lot during the conflict, the war. And I don't know what is the point of not withdrawing the troops from the region because they're going to get killed, what is the point after all? Zelensky, what does he want, in your opinion?
Well, Zelensky has picked this guy Sirski, who will do whatever Zelensky tells him to do. They don't really care much about what happens on the field, except to keep the thing going, so that the Europeans will think that, whoa, they're holding their own. Let's give them $90 billion more. It's crazy. It was crazy from the start, Nima. If you just look at the damn map, pardon my French, the Ukraine is never going to prevail against Russia, and certainly they're not even going to be able to give them a strategic defeat. I don't know what these people were thinking in Washington that they could do this. Obama was smarter. He said, "No, this is crazy. Don't ever give the Ukrainians the idea they can prevail over a much stronger Russia on their doorstep." There's one thing that came out on the day before. Well, let's see. What's the? It was Saturday when Putin appeared in fatigues. Taking a briefing, and they go through all the advances that the troops along the front line have made. And then I read it to the end. That's what we had to do when I was on active duty, so to speak. Read the whole damn thing. And this is what he says at the end. He says, Gerasimov was the chief of staff. What I hear from you and from other commanders, these reports, judging by the pace we are observing in the line of contact, get this now. Our interest in the withdrawal of Ukrainian military formations from the territories they now occupy has effectively become obsolete, is practically reduced to zero, end quote. Wow. Now, he did that right before he knew Trump was going to call him. Okay. Called him the next morning. So here's Putin saying, look, this business about negotiating a troop withdrawal for the Ukrainians, we're going to negotiate like by just pushing them out of those things. We don't even think it's important, his words. Uh, it's practically reduced to zero. The fact that we're interested in the withdrawal, negotiated withdrawal of these troops. Well, my read of that is that um, Putin said the same thing to Trump when he called earlier yesterday morning. He said, "Look, you know, we're prevailing here. Um, we don't really need to worry about negotiating a deal about the rest of the Donbass. It's a matter of months, maybe weeks, but we can do that." And sotto voce, he's saying, "Now, when we told you in Alaska, that is Putin, that we had some flexibility. This is a guess on my part. There are other sort of things we can work out deals on. Okay, maybe Zaporozhye, maybe Kherson. Yeah, they're part of Russia now, but with some imaginative negotiating, yeah, we can do something about that. Meanwhile, we got Kharkov, we got Odessa, we got other. let's deal. Now we got two groups forming up, and that's going to happen. So what I'm thinking here is that this thing is slow. It's very complicated, as Trump has learned in these past months. But it need not be so complicated as can't result in a mutual deal that Putin wants mostly as a way of the U.S. recognizing Russia's core interests, as they should have done back in December of 2021, and saying, okay, we'll give Ukraine certain assurances, that is, the U.S. will, that they're not going to be invaded again, but we'll keep your army low, and we can work this thing out. Now, when Trump was asked, well, suppose you can't work it out, he says, well, more people die. Well, we can't work it out. We can't work it out. Okay. Well, Putin's notion is, oh, that would be unfortunate because then we would just have a rump Ukraine, which we'd have to deal with continually, and there would be no overarching supervisory mechanism to ensure, at best, neutrality, ensure that the Ukrainians keep their guns away from us. So I think Putin wants more. I think he'll be further patient, the more so since he's winning. He's very, very clearly winning. And the Europeans and Zelensky, as I see it, really have no cards. Now, let me add one other thing. It's related to all this, but before I forget it, sometimes I forget things. There is one outstanding issue between Russia and the United States, and that is the last arms control treaty called New Start. New Start. It expires on February the 5th.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I mention this, Nima, is because if I'm Putin and I'm with my colleagues and I'm saying, do you think Trump is interested in deal on Ukraine? And we say, well, yeah, we think he is. Do you think he's sposobny, able? Do you think he's able? Oh, we don't know about so much about that. Is he his own man? We're not sure. Oh, here's the litmus test. You, Mr. Putin, made an overture, a personal overture. It was very, very orchestrated to the President of the United States to keep the limits, the quantitative limits, 1,500 strategic missiles, something like that, for New Start, which expires on February 5th. Can't be renewed again. It's already been renewed once. It expires, right? You offered him on September 22nd a deal where you would keep those quantitative limits for another year if both sides agreed to do that. Now, why is it he can't answer you? I mean, he said 2 weeks after you made the he said, well, sounds like a good idea to me. And as you know, Mr. Putin, we've been pressing everyone, Witkoff, everybody else, but they don't talk about it. Now, that's the litmus test, Mr. President. If Putin, I'm sorry, Mr. Putin, if Trump can't gather enough strength to do this simple thing that requires no further negotiation, but would be a wonderful earnest of his good intentions to put a cap on the arms race or to keep at least some sort of restraints on it. If he can't do that, he's not his own man, Mr.
Yeah.
Putin. We can't assure you he's his own man. And so, what he promises on Ukraine, well, we got to look at that with a grain of salt too. So, luckily, we don't have to worry too much about it. It'd be unfortunate if he can't come to terms on Ukraine, but it's still more unfortunate if he allows an unrestrained arms race, and that would be our best measure of his not his intentions, but his ability to be nagovor sposobny, to be able to make a deal, to negotiate some sort of treaty or other arrangement. So this is all very Putin and Lavrov and others have said this explicitly, and Ryabkov came out with a Christmas Eve thing that won't quit. It's really, really interesting. And the last thing I'll say about Ryabkov is that in this long treatise, uh, depicting pretty accurately the course of events on Ukraine, he finishes up with a question. It says, "Now, Mr. Ryabkov, what do you think about the Nobel Peace Prize? Do you think that Trump would like to have the? Do you think he deserves to have the Nobel Peace Prize?" Canned question, okay, but in a major, major policy statement. So so Ryabkov responds very diplomatically. He says, I know that Trump is very interested in coming to an agreement. I know he is. And I'm sure he's going to make every effort. And if he does, well, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't say explicitly, yeah, then he deserves every Nobel Peace Prize he can get. But that's the sense. So, you know, it may seem trite or adolescent for me to think that's a factor, but I think the Russians think it's a factor too. And if they can play on that, we might see a very, very interesting January coming up.
Yeah. I think, Ray, one of the key issues is the security. And today, Donald Trump said Europe will take a significant share of Ukraine's security responsibilities with the US, the United States support. Eh, How about that? Is there something going on between the United States and Europe that is not published, that is not discussed in the mainstream media, maybe?
Well, as I read it, Nima, Trump has said, Europeans, you want to support Ukraine? Please be our guest, support them. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is they cannot support Ukraine. They don't have the weapons, they don't have the money, they don't have the kinds of things that the US used for 3+ years, right? So, yeah, we're happy for the Europeans to give Kiev whatever guarantees they like. You know, they won't be NATO guarantees because we, the US, pretty much have run NATO, and without us, NATO is zero. Okay, so it's all kind of orchestrated, sort of like a, a kind of a play act. The Europeans are going to do this now, but they really can't do it. As I said before, the reasoning for the last 6 weeks has been we're not going to give any more weapons to Ukraine, we, the United States. But we'll sell the weapons to the Europeans, okay? And then the Europeans can give them to Ukrainians. Now, what's the problem with that? Problem is that we have no weapons to sell right now. It'll take a couple of years before they're produced. The Europeans don't have any money to buy them right now. They're not going to have money 3 years from now either. And when they get to the Ukrainians, nominally, if they do get to the Ukrainians will have no army with which to man these weapons. So, it all sounds kind of bizarre, but people are not discerning enough to realize that a lot of these things are empty promises and that without the US in Europe, in NATO, as it has been since 1949, NATO doesn't amount to much. And, you don't have to rely on me to say that. You see others say that. And actually, Putin himself said that during that long, I think it was that long Q&A. But, getting back to what he said before those soldiers and the chief of staff, um, we really don't need any accord to keep moving uh, against the Ukrainian troops that now occupy parts of the territory we claim. Now, if they're willing to come to some sort of arrangement, willing to deal, we show some flexibility. You know that, Mr. Trump. Well, it all depends on whether Zelensky and Sierski decide they'd really like to hang on for a long period of time. Now, last thing here, I don't think they're long for this world. Zelensky, every one of his chief lieutenants has been shown to be totally corrupt. Everyone. And Umerov, who did the negotiating, he's under some cloud too. Now, who's orchestrating all these reports? My old friends in the CIA. They set up this inspectorate, and they're going after people in the parliament now. Now, do you think they're doing that on their own? I don't think so. In my day, at least, the CIA did things under instructions, sometimes not very nice things, but here they're undermining the people that are running Ukraine. So, is Zelensky above it all, like Caesar's wife? He's the only non-corrupt politician in Ukraine? I don't think so. And as Trump said yesterday, I think he said that 91% of the Ukrainians want an end to the war. That's a factor here. And how long Zelensky can stay in this thing, whether he's thrown out by the Nazis or he's thrown out by the inspectors that the CIA set up in this inspectorate thing, is nobody knows right now. There doesn't seem to be any big favorite to replace Zelensky, although this fellow Budanov, who's head of military intelligence, is making some strange noises like we ought to recognize reality now. And that fellow that went, Zaluzhny, who went to London as ambassador, he's thrown his cat in the ring. So it's all for the Americans to sort of, and the Europeans to the extent they want to, well, MI6 of Britain, they're involved in this. They have to figure out how to handle this thing once the facts on the ground are even more established, which they will be in just a couple more weeks. It's just a matter of time before they reach the Dnieper River. I don't think they want to go any farther. What they really like is not to have to go any farther, but to have a deal that they could depend on. I think that's in the offing if Trump, the mercurial Trump, the delusional, narcissistic Trump, can act as his own man and use the influence that he does have and overcome his opposition, not only in Europe, but the Rubios, the Kellogg's, the Hickseths, maybe of this world. I'm hopeful he can. I think this sort of happened before, but this time I think it's for real. To quote the philosopher Donald Trump, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ray, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
You're most welcome, Nima, and thanks for making time for me.
My pleasure as always, Ray.